elements of change to call into questions, the applicability of some of the rules which we had learned, I think quite rightly, from history. And I think in particular some of the fears of the intellectuals, and Andrei Vososinsky is certainly one of them in that group, that somehow the masses of the people were not reliable in terms of reacting to reform or to liberalism, that they were still too mired in the old traditions, still looking for a strong leader, still looking in effect to be told what to do rather than doing it themselves. That may still be true, and yet somehow
Good morning. The Living World History interview this morning will be with the Honorable Jack Matlock, United States Ambassador to the Soviet Union. Ambassador Matlock has had a long, distinguished career with the Department of State, serving variously in European and Third World countries. He is here as a sesquicentennial lecturer for Duke University's 150th anniversary, and has consented this morning to discuss with us his reflections on the topics we shall be discussing. Our interviewers today will include Martin Miller, Professor of History at Duke, Thomas Naylor, Professor of Economics at Duke, and I am Warren Lerner, Chairman of the Department of History at Duke. And as such, I will take upon myself the privilege of asking the first question of Ambassador Matlock. I know that you have been in the Soviet Union off and on for a great many years in various diplomatic positions. And I would begin by asking you to state briefly as what you see as the most vivid comparison between when you began in the embassy in Soviet conditions and the situation of 1989.
I think the situation that stands most in contrast for an outsider, for a foreigner in Moscow, is the greater accessibility of Soviet citizens and Soviet officials. Things were really very tight in the early 60s. In 61, when I first went to the embassy, we had contacts, official contacts with our division in the foreign ministry, with a few other officials with whom we had direct business, and very few other contacts. Now we have contacts with virtually every element of society, even some like the military who were closed for a long time.
I know that you were chargé d'affaires of the embassy in the early 60s, and particularly during those hectic days of the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. I wonder if you would care to comment on the stakes as they appeared from Moscow in that hectic fall of 1962.
Well, I wasn't chargé then. Actually, I was the second secretary in the political section. But I did work on the communications that went back and forth between Khrushchev and President Kennedy. And specifically, we translated Khrushchev's messages before their transmission to Kennedy, because at that time we had no way to transmit Russian language or Cyrillic characters, so the fastest way to get a message was to translate it first into English. The mood in the embassy, frankly, was that we were very eager to see the president stand firm and insist that the missiles be removed. We were frankly, and perhaps misguidedly, but we were not very worried about the impact of a military strike if that's what it took, because our sense was that there was no way that the Soviet Union at that time was going to risk war with us. And we thought it was a pretty outrageous gambit to place the missiles in Cuba, and our main concern was to see them removed as rapidly as possible. And we sensed that there wasn't really a war scare. We noted that Khrushchev and the Soviet leadership never told the Soviet people what the crisis was all about. It was pictured as American threats against Cuba, and not until his final message, which was publicized, did Soviet people begin to realize what the real issue was. Even then, he spoke in guarded terms, saying, "We will remove those weapons which you consider offensive." And suddenly, even informed Soviet citizens began to say, "My God, did he really put nuclear missiles on Cuba?" I think our overall sentiment was that we were not eyeball to eyeball in terms of nuclear war. As we later learned, the view was in Washington, but in fact we could have played that any way we wished with impunity. Now I would add that I do not think that situation exists today. The overwhelming strategic superiority that we had at the time, plus overwhelming superiority in that region, military forces, I think gave us options which in a comparable situation today we wouldn't have, but of course we hope we won't face a comparable situation today.
Just to follow up on that, from your position then, as best as you can recall it, what was the view of Khrushchev's intention in initiating what became, in fact, as we perceived it at home, precisely an eyeball-to-eyeball situation? What was the view in terms of what Khrushchev was trying to accomplish?
We assumed that what he was trying to accomplish was essentially an act of blackmail. By placing the missiles and with the hope that they would be operational before we discovered them, we thought that he was trying to force us into a concession, in some other area, obviously with the threat that missiles could then be fired against U.S. cities. Of course, up until that time, they did not have the capability of hitting American territory. So that was our assumption. Now, in a recent conference in Moscow of participants, very interesting one, the Soviets stressed that the principal motivation they claim now was to protect Cuba against invasion. I suspect that there may be some, might say some rationalization after the fact in that thought, because even then they admitted that Khrushchev got the idea after he visited Bulgaria and was told that there were American missiles in Turkey. And therefore, when he was told later that they did have certain numbers of intermediate range missiles which they were going to move, apparently that was the genesis of the idea that, well, why don't we put them on Cuba? So I still suspect that the principal motivation was the one that we assumed at the time.
Is it possible, given the proximity of the Bay of Pigs invasion and the crisis, that Soviet intelligence may in fact have been aware of some kind of a planning of this kind and overreacted?
Well, this is the claim that some of the Soviet participants made in the recent conference.
That's right.
In fact, I think there's no evidence whatsoever that after the Bay of Pigs we were planning any sort of intervention. And I must say the American participants in that conference, which included Sorensen, McNamara, and a number of other sort of leading officials of the Kennedy administration, also said there was absolutely no thought of further intervention in Cuba. So if this was their reading, it was a misreading.
Mr. Ambassador, moving the clock forward 20 years or so to the 1980s, in this December 1988 address to the United Nations, Mr. Gorbachev called for increased global interdependence and essentially elimination of use of military force as a tool of diplomacy. Then in his inaugural address, President Bush called for a kinder nation and a more gentle society, and in fact did not have one single unkind word to say about the Soviet Union. What does all this mean in terms of our future foreign policy with the Soviet Union?
Well, I think we need to recognize that there has been a very substantial improvement in relations. This is not the first time that's happened, of course, and we've had a sort of roller coaster in the past with relations improving, a wartime alliance, which soon descended into a very active Cold War, then various thaws, détentes, etc. along the way, each of which ended at some point, in our eyes at least, because of some outrageous Soviet action, which culminated sometimes a series of actions. The invasion of Afghanistan, for example, came on top of increased military intervention elsewhere in the world, in Africa, Latin America, etc. So that obviously we have gone through improvements before, but this time I think there are differences, because I think the biggest difference now is that there is a process of reform underway within the Soviet Union. And although we still cannot be confident where that's going to lead or even how long it will be sustained. At the same time, I think it is clear already that they're getting at some of the basic things which were the underlying causes of problems in the past. So I think we can legitimately hope that with careful management and with a certain amount of luck perhaps, we can establish a relationship on a rather different basis from that we've had for the last few decades.
In the lead editorial of the New York Times on Sunday, April 2nd, the editor declared the Cold War is over. Do you believe the Cold War is over?
I think that's premature, but I think my main problem is I don't believe in reasoning on the basis of slogans. Now, a term like the Cold War is a slogan. It can mean many things to different people. And if one means, for example, that the Soviets are now redefining their foreign policy interests, which they are, that they are talking about, for example, the need to have the common interests of mankind be the determining factor in international relations rather than the international class struggle, which of course was the ideological basis for military intervention and many other types of activity which we opposed, then of course that means we may be on the course to eliminating what we call the Cold War in the past. If, however, we have in mind, if we mean that the Soviet military establishment has been decreased or repositioned in a way it's no longer threatening, that clearly has not happened. And so I think to be prudent, we must look at the world as it exists now, not as it has been proclaimed to be at some point in the future. And in other words, I think we need to see the changes before we assume that everything in the past is gone. I think we can hope for those changes. But simply to say, well, the Cold War is over, I just don't think that's very helpful. I think it's better to look carefully at what has changed, what hasn't changed, and react to that.
Well, you know, many of us who've been observing the Soviet Union from afar for many years were always struck by the impact of the World War II experience in Soviet leadership, almost to the point of irrationality at times. And one of the things that caught our interest in the 1980s is with Gorbachev's elevation to the position of party leadership. He seems to have brought in a new generation with him, who almost can be understood in terms of the year of their birth. That was the people born around late 1920s, early 1930s, who, while remembering World War II, may not be using it quite as a point of reference in foreign policy and attitudes towards the outside world. I wonder if you think there's any validity to this view.
Oh, I think there's a good bit of validity to it.
Yeah.
Obviously, the war experience is one which is still certainly widely known, even though now the majority of people were born after the war. There's much in the media, in the culture, films, plays, books that keep alive that experience. So it is by no means a dead experience in terms of the culture. But there's no question that the great majority of the people did not go through that searing experience, or a majority did not. Therefore, they do look at it in a different way, and I would say somewhat comparable to the fact that from roughly the 70s on, I think our population was not quite so motivated by the experience of having gone through the Depression. In the early 30s, I know that in the 40s and the 50s, this was such a searing experience for that generation that it did bring on, I think, in many ways, we either have been freed from it or maybe have forgotten some of those lessons as we look at our reactions in the 70s and 80s. But in the same way, I think the fears and other inhibitions engendered by the war are less powerful. On the other hand, in a certain sense, the experience of Stalinism is being revived now. It was not talked about in an objective way, and I think the big new sensations have to do with drawing on that experience, and there's been much more publicization of what was done to their own society by Stalin and the ravages of Stalinism, and I think that is being faced much more openly than it was in the past. So this past is still with them, but the war experience as itself is becoming a part of an overall history which includes also the experience of totalitarianism. And I think that does bring some rather major differences in the way that things are assessed, particularly emotionally, by the population as a whole.
In terms of the experience of ordinary day-to-day life of occupying such a significant position as you do, my first visit to the Soviet Union was in the middle 60s, 1966 actually, and I recall at the time that one of the difficulties faced by all of us who were there, regardless of our capacity, whether we were scholars or journalists or diplomats, was the difficulty of having access to Soviet society. The diplomats at the time, and we did go to the embassy occasionally, as well as the journalists, were under enormous sets of restrictions from where they lived to who they could see. Would you say that there's any indications that Glasnost has eased the interrelationship between Americans, particularly diplomats, and Soviet society?
Well, very much so. I think, as I said at the outset, that's one of the most striking changes as compared with the time when I was first there. We have relatively free access to Soviet society now. There are probably still some elements that are a little hard to see on a regular basis. For example, junior military officers, we wouldn't have an awful lot of contact with them. We have quite a bit with senior military officers, whereas before that was practically non-existent. But by and large, the access to even to students, to society as a whole, is much improved, and I would say is rapidly approaching the stage that it's not that different from many countries in the West. There's still some inhibitions, so I'm not going to say it's totally free at the moment, but my impression is that Soviet guests, for example, of the embassy no longer have to get approval from sort of the security people where they work to see us and so on. Now, there are probably still secret installations where they are forbidden to see us. I have no doubt about that. But by and large, in most cases, they certainly come with alacrity and often on short notice, which tends to imply that they don't have to go through the sort of bureaucratic approval which was routine even 5 years ago.
What about the difficult situations that I'm sure the embassy has certainly found itself in the past, where, let's take two different kinds of examples. One, a very established pianist like Vladimir Feltzman, and on the other hand, the Siberians who basically came into the embassy and were there for quite a long period of time. Or is it less likely that that kind of those difficult situations would be faced in the future, would you say?
I think that's much less likely. One thing, immigration is up considerably, that is the Soviet approval of immigration permits, to the point that more people are getting permission to immigrate more rapidly than we can process ourselves under our own laws and regulations. We now have a backlog of 19,000 would-be immigrants, and it's growing every month because now the administration just recently went to the Congress and asked for an extra 30,000 numbers, as we put it, quota numbers a year over the next 5 years to take care of this flow, because last year we suddenly ran out of possibilities for refugee processing. And in many cases, the normal immigration is difficult because of either lack of financing or lack of close relatives here. So that's the situation that on the Soviet side is easing up greatly. Even more noticeable is the increase in private visits. We are now issuing over 4,000 visas a month for purely private visits. Now, this compared with even 3 or 4 years ago, there might have been 150 a year. Now, 4,000 a month at an annual rate is getting pretty close to 50,000. And this year we may run 50,000 because it's a rising number. And this is just purely people going for entirely private reasons. In addition, we have close to 2,000 a month, anywhere from 1,500 to 2,000, officially sponsored visas. So the fact of the matter is that our embassy in Moscow is now one of the 10 largest visa issuing posts in the world. And that, a few years ago would have been inconceivable. I mean, we're issuing more than Rome, for example. What this shows us is that the whole procedure to immigrate and permission to immigrate or to travel, and in some cases, if people can travel more freely, they probably will decide not to immigrate. Because in part, the desire to immigrate was driven by the difficulty in traveling, so you sort of had to make a choice. So I think the sort of things that the Pentecostalists having to take refuge in the embassy is getting less likely. So far as the Feltzman case was concerned, of course, he was a refusenik, denied immigration for a long time, and then in addition there were forms of harassment, such as when he was to give a concert at Spasso House, our ambassador's residence, when my predecessor was there. Someone slipped in, cut a string on the piano, for example. That sort of dirty tricks. I think we're seeing a lot less of that now. And as a matter of fact, as immigration has gotten easier, so has the encouragement of Soviet emigres who've left in the past to come back and perform. We had a major show by the emigre artist Shemyakin just 2 weeks ago. It opened in the Tretyakov Gallery with immense interest. And we have had some performers coming back. I understand that Baryshnikov will come back with the American Dance Theater and perform soon. And though it is probably not official yet or even formally decided, I won't be surprised to see within the next couple of years Rostropovich coming back with the National Symphony. So I think all of that is now becoming politically possible and even encouraged by the current leadership. So I think all of that means that the sort of problems you referred to are much less likely. I can't say they couldn't happen because there is still some harassment, there are still limitations, the secret police is still active, but that would be, I think, most unlikely.
Following up on Professor Miller's question, Mr. Ambassador, in light of the developments you're just mentioning in terms of the improvement in the Soviet immigration policies and human rights record in general, isn't it time for our government to rethink the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which links the granting of most favored nation status to the Soviet Union to human rights policies in general and the Jewish immigration issue in particular? Isn't the Jackson-Vanik Amendment really a Cold War anachronism, and shouldn't it be reviewed at this time?
Well, I think it is clear that some of the objectives of Jackson-Vanik are now, there has been progress toward meeting them. Of course, Jackson-Vanik, although many think it is aimed at Jewish immigration, as the law is written, it is aimed at immigration. And it states that the president must certify that a nation allows free immigration in order to overcome the penalties of Jackson-Vanik, which is denial of most favored nation treatment for tariff on new goods, plus denial of any Ex-Im Bank credits or guarantees. Now, I think we are reaching the point that it becomes, we should be making soundings with the various interested groups and with the Congress as to whether, in political terms, this has gone far enough to allow a waiver. The law does allow a one-year waiver if there are assurances are received from the government in question that the situation will improve. Now, in fact, the Soviet government now has announced a goal of completely free immigration with the exception of those who have access to secrets. We think that they are using that loophole much too broadly and beyond sort of a reasonable test, but in general they are moving in the direction they have declared. But I think this does become a political question as to the desires of the Congress. You may recall the Congress put this amendment on without the sponsorship of the administration, and in a sense I suspect that most administrations will want the Congress to take the lead, at least in letting us know that it's consistent with their desires if a waiver is granted or if it is changed in any way.
Mm-hmm. Related to Jackson-Vanik, do you anticipate increased flows of bilateral trade between the United States and the Soviet Union? They wore up a bit in 1988 after being flat.
Yes, I think we may see modest increases, but I don't think we're going to see sudden or dramatic increases for the simple reason that they don't have the money to support a complete increase in foreign trade. You know, if you look at the amount of Soviet capacity to trade internationally, that is their access to hard currency, you find that the volume of trade in hard currency is about on the magnitude of, say, Switzerland or Denmark. So it's not nearly the market, practically speaking, that the size would indicate, or the size or the needs of their economy. And I think that is the big inhibiting factor, is simply that that they don't have the means to pay for increased inputs. And since most exporters like to get paid this is a rather substantial inhibiting factor.
Would you say there are any imaginative ways in which we can address this problem? The market is obviously there.
Well, the market is there, of course, if you can figure out a way to get paid, and that, of
Yeah.
course, has been one of the rocks on which that particular ship tends to founder. I'm not sure that there are imaginative ways to get around that very basic problem until the Soviets put their own house in order in terms of having a more rational economy, in terms of moving toward currency convertibility, and these other things which I think even they recognize in theory they must do, but they haven't done it yet, and it's going to be some time. And I'm not sure we can do much until their own system evolves to the point that makes the interface between us more realistic.
Well, would it be prudent for the United States to take a few risks, as it often does in a country whose economy it wants to encourage?
I think, well, if what you mean
Yeah.
is should we make large loans, perhaps at
Yeah.
low interest rates, no, I would say definitely not. Because I think in the first place, the risk would be too great in economic terms. But second, I'm not even sure that would help a great deal. I think what our policy should be encouraging is some hard choices on the Soviet part. And these are hard choices because some are painful to make, but they need to move toward a market economy. They need to move toward a more openness in decision making, which makes it possible for say plant managers or others to make economic decisions. They need to move away from excessive bureaucratic controls. Some deals, for example, require the approval of 39 different agencies and that sort of things, which are apt to put on totally unreasonable requirements, some of which are justifiable only from the standpoint of the bureaucratic interests of that particular organization, not of the country as a whole. Now, when they're operating under such disabilities, I think it would not be prudent for us to, in effect, to make it easy to continue to operate under those. I think you're apt to end up the way we did with Poland in the 1970s, when year after year we gave large loans in the hope that this would help them to solve some of their economic problems, become more independent. The end result was we saved them from the necessity of, in effect, biting the bullet and making the hard decisions, and we lost the money, and they didn't get their reforms. So in effect, it had a completely perverse effect, and I think the same would be likely to happen in the Soviet Union today if we were to follow that course.
Well, what you say about the managerial responsibilities and bureaucratic layers is quite obviously correct. But I wonder if there isn't a problem at the other level of a worker ethic too, which is cynical, uncaring is the wrong word, but cynical, sort of schlumperei, and a feeling that what the heck, why bother?
Absolutely. The average attitude is, if they're going to pretend to pay me, I'll pretend to work.
Yes.
And maybe I won't, and since they don't even pretend to pay me very well, I won't even pretend to work very well. And I think this is quite natural. Frankly, in my opinion, the Russian worker is no more stupid than anybody else. In fact, he may be a little smart on this score. And is no less capable of hard work than workers elsewhere. But if you don't give them incentives, number one, and also you don't have disincentives in terms of bad work carries no particular penalties, then of course, they're not stupid. And they say most are not going to work for nothing. As somebody has said, well, there's 15-20% of the population that are so motivated simply to perform that they'll probably perform under virtually any circumstance. And there may be another 15 or 20% that are probably going to be low performers in any society. But talking about that critical 50-60% in the middle, you need incentives, you need a structure which really makes it more, gives them a better life if they work harder and so on. Now, I think if you can do that, then you will get greater motivation. Obviously, you can't do that overnight, but they need a system which rewards effort, which rewards performance, which they don't have now. They need a system for which, when there is performance and when you get money, you can buy something with it that is meaningful to the worker, which they don't have now. And so there are really a lot of underlying causes for this, which are not going to be easy to correct. And yet, I think it's pretty easy to analyze what the problem is. finding a way to get from where they are to where they should be is the difficult part.
In looking back over the long stretch of time as an historian for a moment, which I tend to do, the role of ambassadors and diplomats in Imperial Russia and also in the Soviet Union has gone through various periods of enormous influence, and at other times much less so. The 18th century, long ago, foreign diplomats actually participated in deciding who would be successors to the throne. I'm thinking also of one of your most illustrious predecessors in this century, George Kennan, who actually formulated a policy which was extraordinarily influential while he was ambassador. And my question, which I'm leading up to, is this. I'm interested in attitudes and policy. We're all interested in world peace and interrelationships. Things have changed so much that Americans, I think, are dazzled right now about how we should think about the Soviet Union. It's been an enormous change. My students, for example, are growing up, the more I think about it, in a world in which the notion of evil empire itself is already something of the past, and that's all to the good. Question, though, is about the information from where you sit in Moscow. The elections that have just taken place are again, of extraordinary interest. The fact that people could cross out a ballot in a situation in which only one person was running and actually defeat that person is very, very crafty, it seems to me. Do we have the information, judging again from what you know, to sort of be able to think about the fact that there's some kind of organization that even the press hasn't told us about that allows people to act in such a politically sophisticated manner?
Well, I think one can exaggerate the degree of organization or premeditation that sort of went into these last elections. In a general sense, I suspect that those who proposed this particular system, and first and foremost, General Secretary Gorbachev, did, in fact, try to create the sort of situation which it resulted in. And if so, this would have been a brilliant political stroke, because basically the task of a Soviet leader in making perestroika work is to bring sufficient pressures, real pressures, to bear on the bureaucracy there, and particularly the party bureaucracy, to make them change the way they do things. Now, this is enormously hard, because among other things, he is asking the party bureaucracy itself to give up many of its powers. These party bureaucrats, particularly at the local level, but also at the central level, have been involved in the day-to-day sort of nitpicking management of virtually everything. And of course, this is one of the reasons that things work so poorly. The people nominally in charge, in effect, have to defer to the party, and this means that the buck always gets passed up, and it gets passed higher and higher, and it means even at the very top, the Politburo is spending a lot of its time essentially making trivial decisions which no one else is willing to take the responsibility for and do. So this has resulted in an almost total top-down management of the whole country. He's trying to change that. He's trying to change it to a bottom-up. Well, how do you get the party out of the way, after all? Well, you can cut their staff, you can theoretically cut their prerogatives, but you can't do that anymore by the old methods, that is, using draconian ones or using force. When people resisted Peter the Great, as you know, he would line up a few in Red Square on Lobное место, and you would have some public executions. And this had a certain stimulating effect, or at least a certain discouraging effect, toward certain types of behavior. Maybe all of them didn't cut off their beards, and maybe in the final analysis it wasn't all that necessary that they do so. But I think historians can look back and say, well, he changed a few things, which but Gorbachev can't do that, and I doubt if he really wants to. It was a very revealing exchange with some citizens in Siberia last fall when they were complaining about local conditions, and one of them said to Gorbachev, he was walking around the streets, and all this was on television, you've got to make some hedgerow. And he said, we've had too many hedge rolling in this country. We're going to do it a different way this time. So to get to my point, in a sense, he's got to find the mechanisms which bring effective pressures to bear, other than those that he can mount from the top, on the party apparatus. And this, I think, was a dandy idea. Now, exactly how it's going to work, exactly how they will manage the process that has been unleashed, I don't know. That's going to be one of the fascinating things we'll be watching. But when one sees, as we did the day of the election, and afterwards as the returns came in, that in many areas, not in all by any means, but in a number of key areas, quite unexpectedly, the party people the local party people lost, and lost even though there was no opposition candidate. I like to say it takes real talent to lose an election when you don't have an opponent. But believe me, they've got people out there, quite a few people, with just that sort of talent, in that they've made themselves very disliked. And by their, you might say, imperial ways, by their autocratic ways. And the people obviously want something different. Now, that's one thing. And I think this leads to a situation that a party leader who wants reform, by using these pressures, and I must say that those who lost most handily or most spectacularly were those who were reputed to be most dubious about the reform program itself. And I think this clearly, so I think that the reformers can now say, aha, you see, the people really do want reform, and they're speaking out. And even though the offices to which they were electing people may not be particularly significant in and of themselves, the political message is a very strong one, particularly when it is combined with more openness. And another thing about this election was, despite the fact that initially we detected a good bit of really indifference and even cynicism among the population, when they announced they were going to be having new elections and a new Supreme Soviet, most people said, well, so what else is new? I mean, we've had these things before and it makes no difference. As the nomination process got underway, and as they began to allow demonstrations, to allow meetings, to allow real campaigns to be mounted, people began to get caught up in it. And in places like Moscow and Leningrad, certainly in the Baltic states, you had really a great outpouring of public participation, of the likes of which we really haven't seen in that country since maybe the election of the Constituent Assembly.
That's right, 1918.
And this is really quite remarkable. Now, it didn't touch all parts of the country. And I think the interesting thing to watch is, number one, how the authorities react to the results of this one. Will the people who lost spectacularly in the elections to the Congress of People's Deputies lose their current jobs? Will they be pushed aside? Or will there be efforts to sort of contain this with minimal damage? Now, that if they do the latter, then the cynicism will probably descend upon them again. On the other hand, if they see that in fact they can affect whether the person stays in the party job and whatnot, then I think you'll get a groundswell of even greater activism this fall when the local and republic elections are held. And this is going to be a fascinating period to see how that develops.
The assumption then is that there is not an organization that is, let's say, ground level politics in touch with Gorbachev, but rather it's a kind of spontaneous move.
I think there is a lot of spontaneous
Okay.
elements to it, and I don't think it's certainly not organized nationally. Sometimes you get people develop, for example, the Yeltsin campaign in Moscow. There were a lot of people out organizing and working, but this was to a great extent spontaneous. And I think mutatis mutandis, this is true elsewhere. In some of the Baltic states, you probably had much more organized campaigns for some of the popular front candidates, or in Lithuania, Sąjūdis. But by and large, a lot of this was spontaneous.
Mr. Ambassador, to me, one of the most interesting and I think unique aspects of Mr. Gorbachev, not only in comparison to previous Soviet leaders, but perhaps even to Western leaders, is his psychological sophistication, particularly in dealing with his adversaries. And to some extent, that's what you've been talking about, whether his adversary is someone within the party who's opposed to him, some of the so-called ethnic minorities in Armenia, Azerbaijan, Lithuania, or the Eastern European allies, that he essentially employs a non-confrontational style. It's a more of let's talk, let's negotiate, co-opting, but rarely is it confrontational. Where do you think this psychological sophistication comes from? And it requires, I believe, a lot of discipline to behave in that fashion.
Well, I'm sure it does. It's awfully hard, of course, to say where elements of a person's personality come. One could say, where did Khrushchev get some of his insights that were shown in his memoirs, if not always in the period of his rule, coming up entirely in the Stalinist system? How do how did he develop those things? I'm not sure. I'm not a psychoanalyst. I've never had them on the couch to probe. I would say that I think you're right in saying that, particularly on many of the nationality issues and some of the other political issues, when movements have started to press forward a given idea, Gorbachev's reaction has been to negotiate, not to repress. Now, whether this is a matter of deep psychological sophistication or whether it is simply a very realistic realization that if he starts using force, if heads start rolling, to use the earlier imagery, that you can kiss goodbye your whole plan to try to open up the society and get creativity coming up from the bottom up. After all, his basic task, and I do have to give him credit for a lot of wisdom in understanding this, is to somehow change the total top-down management of that society to one that at least has substantial elements of bottom-up creativity and activism. Now, this is at the root of how you make that society more productive, more dynamic, how you bring it in terms of modern society. I think he understands that. And that dictates, of course, that you've really got to use a minimal of repressive measures, because that simply reinforces all the top-down habits that this society has had for centuries. And so in that sense, yes. But in a personal sense, of course, he is quite capable of saying enough is enough. In fact, he's quite capable of berating speakers he doesn't agree with. And people have said, well, there are elements of arrogance there. So in a personal sense, he's gotten very angry at times. He did in Yerevan when he went down after the earthquake and felt that some of the elements were still dealing with politics at a time of tragedy, and I think it showed. So I would say he knows how to draw the line to say enough is enough, and this is the way it's going to be. But I suppose a political leader does require some of that too. So I wouldn't exaggerate. It's not all simply concession and negotiation, but certainly that has been a big element in his strategy.
But two other examples come to mind in the way that he related to President Reagan. His response, or rather non-response, to the Iran-Contra affair and to the demise of Iran Air Flight 655. I think if it had been Brezhnev or Khrushchev, they would have been all over Reagan's case. And Gorbachev said almost nothing. The foreign ministry said something, but Gorbachev himself did not jump on that, or even this very week, the visit to Havana, where there clearly are differences of opinion between Mr. Gorbachev and Mr. Castro, but again, no confrontation.
Well, yes, I think that's right. In the instances you mentioned, I think you're quite right that there was no overt effort to sort of use them. Actually, I think it would have been quite counterproductive had they tried to.
Sure.
So I think they were wise in not doing so. In other words, on the other hand, something like the Iran-Contra thing, most Russians have trouble understanding why that's an issue. And it's quite clear that they would, given the objective opportunity, you might say, act in a comparable fashion without any great political fallout at home. There's that. Now, of course, the downing the airliner, they did make more use of that because they had been arguing against the U.S. naval presence in the Gulf, and that they had quite a bit to say about that. But on the other hand, we were both trying to get that war ended. I think genuinely so. They wanted to see it ended. We wanted to see it end. So it really wasn't in their overall interest to blow it out of all proportion in a sense that would impede a ceasefire between the parties. And in fact, a ceasefire between the parties came fairly soon after that, which in political terms, at least, made it, international political terms, made it a bit, as we say, OBE, overtaken by events. So I think one can explain in terms of their own interest, their behavior, but I think you're right, it probably is a different behavior from what we would have seen in the past.
If I could slip in one more question, what you just said about the war in the Persian Gulf, you're suggesting there really was a kind of cooperation between the United States and the Soviet Union, which I had conjectured appeared to be the case, but there's really not been so much said about that. So there was behind the scene.
Well, no, I don't want to exaggerate it, because the fact is that neither of us had decisive influence on the parties. Uh-huh. But it was very clear that both of us, for some time, wanted to see that war ended. Uh-huh. In part, I think the Soviets wanted to see it ended because to the degree that one party won over the other would create real problems for them. And also, of course, the Iraqis were dependent upon them for arms. They had trouble cutting them off completely, but to the degree it continued, this made it any sort of rapprochement with Iran much more difficult. So, in fact, I think they judged that the continuation of that war was not in their interest. We certainly judged the same for rather different reasons, but that was the bottom line. And I think that we did consult, we talked this over. I wouldn't say that the two of us together were able to end it. No, I think the parties really and finally just were exhausted. But we did see it in our mutual interest to have it ended, and so far as coordinating on strategy at the UN, Security Council, and other places, we had a lot of talks with them. We didn't always agree on what the procedures ought to be. They did not agree with our sending naval forces into the Persian Gulf. They made that clear. They proposed sort of UN-flagged forces that we thought wouldn't work, and we didn't agree to that. So, you know, I'm not going to say that tactically speaking, we were of one mind. We weren't. But we both were seeking the same end, that is the end of that fighting. And the end of the fighting finally occurred, I think, to the relief of both of us.
I'd like to return to Professor Miller's point about historical analogies of reformers. I think the analogy might be made more meaningfully not with Peter the Great, but with Catherine II, because I think it's very much in my mind. Catherine, I suppose, should have been a reform monarch, educated in the ideas of the French Enlightenment, considering herself an enlightened despot, and yet, in the long run, despite the verbiage, perhaps extending repressive institutions, most notably serfdom. And the reason, of course, is clear in history, is that her own claim to the throne was insecure and threatened, and she needed the support of the nobles and others. Is not Gorbachev in an analogous position, where he can promote reform, but in the final analysis can do nothing to undermine the absolute authority of the party? And that if any reform moves in that direction, they will have to choose between the authority of the party being compromised and the desirability of the reform. In other words, although he is the party leader, he still is responsible for maintaining the party's position and would be seriously challenged if it were eroded in any way.
Well, I certainly understand the theoretical proposition, and it would be hard. I would be hard pressed to deny it. Certainly based on historical experience, and yet I don't think that should blind us to the fact that some of the steps taken, in fact, have eroded the power of the party. Now, I don't. When you allow the sort of elections which occurred, and when you allow, say, a free vote in Moscow district, perhaps for an office that has very little power in and of itself, but you let the party-sponsored candidate receive 6.9% of the vote, and the one running, although a party member, running really against the apparatus there, very overtly get 89.4% of the vote, and you publish those facts, you're doing things that if your only rule was don't allow the power of the party to be compromised, you probably wouldn't do. So I think we are faced with a situation which is fascinating now, because some of the old rules may not totally apply. Now, I would hasten to add that I think that just as Churchill never intended to preside over the dissolution of the British Empire, and in fact, in a literal sense, perhaps he didn't, nevertheless, Gorbachev, I'm sure, doesn't intend to preside over the dissolution of the party. He would argue that the party can be effective and can exercise its leadership role only if it gets out of the day-to-day management, sort of, you might say, ascends or retreats to the high ground of making overall policy, of guiding the society, and that they must use methods of leadership rather than of compulsion to do so. Now, that proposition may or may not be true, but I think he really believes it. I think clearly a lot of people in the party apparatus don't believe it when they see what happens to their own jobs or the way they do things. And of course the big question is, can enough pressures be brought to bear on the latter type, either to push them aside politically so that they don't have an influence on the outcome, or in some cases maybe convince them that they can operate under the new conditions. I would think in particular of one provision which he sprang on the party at the conference last summer, And that was the provision. I say sprang on them because it had not been proposed and discussed earlier. That was the provision that the local party secretary's office be combined with that of the head of the local government, which would be an elective position. And therefore the party secretary in effect would have to run for an elective position. And he said that obviously if the party secretary can't win, he would assume they could in his leadership position, but if he couldn't, the party would have to draw the necessary conclusions. The implication being, you've got to have enough popularity at least to go out there and win an election, or else we'll probably replace you with somebody who can. Now this is bringing the sort of pressure, outside pressure, to bear on the party, which it has not been subjected to any time in its history, really. And whether this is going to work, I don't know. I think that's one of the big questions in seeing. But I do think that there are elements here other than just saying, well, how do we make sure that nothing happens to erode the power of the party as we have seen it exercise up to now. There are new elements here, and conceivably they could lead to something new. But I think there's also no question that nobody at the top in power is, well, they're going to try to manage this process so the party remains in the center of it, and with the broader controls, even if they may delegate some of the direct management responsibilities to lower levels. Whether that can ever work, I don't know.
Well, I was thinking suspicion that in the privacy of the booth that Gorbachev voted for Yeltsin, but that's beside the point. No, but the thing is that the Central Committee's position, I should imagine, is sacred and cannot be challenged, even if a local party secretary can be.
Well, yes and no. There have been no changes in the Central Committee since the last Party Congress. Presumably there will be no changes until the next Party Congress, which at the latest must be held in slightly less than 2 years. Theoretically, it could be held earlier because you can call them more frequently than once every 5 years. The presumption has to be that the plans are for a fairly widespread replacement of Central Committee membership at the next opportunity. We now have close to 90 members of the current 304 or 5 member Central Committee who have lost the jobs that entitle them to membership in effect. In fact, people speak very openly in Moscow of them as dead souls. They are still using the term, of course, from Gogol's novel. This is a different type of dead soul. But in other words, they have lost really their positions of political influence, but they're still sitting there on the Central Committee and casting votes. And we had a fascinating bit of glasnost when it came to the election of the party's slate of candidates to the Congress of People's Deputies. They had 100 seats, they had 100 candidates. This just like the old days, you might say, but he didn't leave a lot to chance when it came to putting it to the full Central Committee for their vote. After all, some people said, well, if there'd been 110 candidates or 120, 10 or 20 of the reformers would have been voted out with the help of the dead souls and some of the others who are clearly the losers in this process. And they may well be the dominant force in the Central Committee. But the Central Committee no longer really represents the party as a whole. Certainly it doesn't represent the reform process. So much of the maneuvering, I think, has been to how to short-circuit that process and make it of less importance. And so in the final analysis, I think that we could say that Central Committee membership, in a certain sense, means less than it did before. Every new First Secretary of the Republican Party who's been named, the last 5 or 6 or even 7 that have been named out of the 15 republics recently have not been members of the Central Committee. Now this didn't happen before. The old nomenclatura rules would have required full Central Committee membership for a position that significant. Many of the oblast secretaries that have been named in the last year, 18 months, were not members of the Central Committee. So they are now ignoring the old nomenclatura rules to bring in new people. And I think that's very significant. So in a certain sense, this membership doesn't mean what it used to, though in a constitutional sense, under the party rules, it still has all the old powers.
I think we have to take a break right now, and we're trying to our labor shortly. I think all of us are encouraged by the opening of discourse in Soviet society. However, in any society, one of the penalties you pay for open expression is expressions you may not care to hear. We often do it ourselves, and you have in the Soviet Union this emergence of a very, very unhappy experience, this Nanu group, which not only calls for change, but values of racial repression and things like that which are not very savory. How would you expect the regime to deal with this? The Pamyat Society.
Pamyat Society,
As
yes.
else.
Well, of course, the Pamyat Society has been extremely controversial.
Yeah.
And I think there's considerable evidence, mainly anecdotal, that at least the top party leaders are encouraging the media to give them as little attention as possible. I think that at least the Soviet leaders now recognize the potential for damage that particularly the anti-Semitism shown by some of the leaders of this group can show. Having said that, I think that it's very clear that some of the themes of the Pamyat Society, that of preservation of Russian culture, respect for the church, and respect for Russian traditions, does really tap fairly deep emotional roots on the part of ethnic Russians, not of other nationalities, but on the part of ethnic Russians. And there is I would say, a more positive side of that, perhaps not fully expressed by Pamyat, but in the activities of people like academician Likhatchov, who is very assiduous in trying to preserve the Russian cultural heritage without suffering from any taint of anti-Semitism, or you might say the extreme chauvinistic aspects. But there's no question that these negative parts of the Russian heritage are still alive, and I think they create really problems for the leadership, because it is a multinational state, and of course to somehow succumb to extreme demands from a group as large and pervasive as the Russians, to act in chauvinistic grounds or act contrary to the interests of other national groups, is very dysfunctional in that particular society.
But they will not close it down.
I don't think they will, because among other things, under the rules of glasnost, it's a little hard to do so. They haven't closed down, for example, overt anti-communist groups and even overt political parties, though they've said they won't allow them legally. The Democratic Union still operates, with some harassment to be sure, but still operates, and unofficial publications now. So I think that there is the feeling that you can't just close them down and at the same time have the sort of openness and glossness that they're talking about. These are genuine feelings, I mean, however regrettable. Yeah.
One of the peculiar, almost unique aspects of the Soviet Union and its Imperial Russian background is the antagonism between modernity and tradition, which I think has embedded itself and in the history of the country. And I think that the contemporary society and I think the political leadership has to confront this, however consciously or unconsciously they prefer to. It's there. Now, when Andrei Voznesensky was here, the great poet, last spring, one of the things he was saying, which reminds me about the Pamyat Society, was the need to deal with the forces that are to be emerged, that will emerge when things open up. It's more than a can of worms. He was rather open about the hate mail that he was getting, and he was actually
Gets a lot of it, and as do some of the other sort of liberal reformers.
Even to the point of being considered a Jew and getting mail, which indicates that they would rather have him removed. Rather frightening kinds of things. Now, the other thing that he was talking about in that context was that the split between, and this is where the tradition and the modernity come up, is that the intelligentsia has always been involved in one side of it, and the society's been divided because of it, and the countryside has been mired in tradition. The work habits you spoke about before, of course, relate to that as well. The question is, as you see it right now, somehow or other, as at least as Voznesensky put it, it's really perestroika that has to work. The glasnost is all very nice, but that can be subject to all sorts of forces if the economic restructuring of the society, in fact, falls on hard ground. Do you think that's true? Is that really where the linchpin of it all is, as you see it?
I'm not sure. You know, I think we are seeing sufficient elements of change to call into questions, the applicability of some of the rules which we had learned, I think quite rightly, from history. And I think in particular some of the fears of the intellectuals, and Andrei Voznesensky is certainly one of them in that group, that somehow the masses of the people were not reliable in terms of reacting to reform or to liberalism, that they were still too mired in the old tradition, still looking for a strong leader, still looking, in effect, to be told what to do rather than doing it themselves. That may still be true, and yet somehow I think that we may be seeing even some change on that front. This is, after all, now a largely literate society, which was not true, at the time of the revolution. Whatever one can say about the Soviet regime, and one can say an awful lot of terrible things, they did teach people to read and write. And you now have media, and media which are picking up a lot of themes which are reaching into people's everyday understanding of things. Now you take the whole anti-Stalinism and an understanding of totalitarianism. Okay, we had the 20th Party Congress where there was a secret speech. Very few heard about that, just party insiders. Then you had an open speech by Khrushchev in the 22nd Party Congress, but he talked really about crimes against party members, etc. Again, although there was great agitation and response on the part of intellectuals, the average person, I'm not sure, paid quite that much attention. Now, however, when you have in the media, on television, and in mass publication stories of individual lives that were ruined, by Stalinism, by the prison camps, you get even average person saying, I didn't know what a monster that man was. We really can't have that anymore. Now, I don't know exactly how this is going to be translated in reaction to things, but it did occur to me at this latest elections that you did have intellectuals who would be considered in our society maybe not the most effective political figures, really running and winning elections and winning by handy margins. And I wonder if we're not maybe not understanding some of the inroads that education, literacy have made in the population as a whole. Maybe that proverbial man, woman on the street understands more than one would think, and as their own intellectuals sometimes suspect. As you well know, there is a strong element in Russian intellectual history of fear of the mob, fear of the masses, which was pretty well founded in the 19th century when you had the reformers going out and often rejected by the very people they wanted to help. And this, of course, is very deep-seated. Maybe they exaggerate it, but I'm asking the question and not trying to give the answer because I don't know the answer.
I'd like to turn to Eastern Europe. On the one hand, many American Sovietologists tell us that it's like a kind of time bomb, a powder keg about to explode. But then there's counter evidence that suggests that Hungary and Poland in particular have taken some giant steps towards political pluralism. The Hungarians have been gradually reforming the economies for 30 years, and the Poles seem to be possibly cleaning up their act. The Czechs and the GDR are much more repressive, not too much happening in terms of reform there. But is it possible that Gorbachev's strategy is something equivalent to the Finlandization of Eastern Europe? His movement towards removing a few of the troops in his December 7th, 88 announcement, but giving them a bit more autonomy? Where is it possible that Finland?
Well, I'm sure he's not thinking of it in those terms, and I'm sure he doesn't use the word Finlandization. But I think the Gorbachev leadership very clearly will allow and even implicitly encourage reform efforts in Eastern Europe. In other words, where in contrast to that, in the past, Soviet leaders stood ready in the final analysis to march in troops if there was really serious reform of the internal structure. I think that has passed, and that all of these East European governments now have the possibility, without Russian intervention, to reform. Now, up to a point, I think there is a certain level of pain, as one may put it, which one could no longer count on the Soviets staying out of the picture. This would be certainly if there were attacks or direct pressure on their military presence in Poland and the GDR. If the East Germans seem to be moving willy-nilly towards some form of reunification with West Germany, there are certain, I think, issues that are still probably would be viewed as so dangerous or so unsettling that it would raise the question of some form of intervention. I'm not going to try to define what those are, and I'm not sure anybody is capable at this point. But I don't think we can dismiss under any conditions Soviet intervention. However, the conditions under which that is likely to occur have certainly become much more narrow, and I think there is a wide range of things which could happen with Soviet approval, or at the very least with Soviet, you might say, a nihil obstat. And that tells me that probably we will see a period where perhaps it can be managed without an explosion of the sort that would bring forcible Soviet intervention. Now, obviously, we are seeing this process moving in Hungary and Poland, as you mentioned. We're not seeing it moving in the GDR and Czechoslovakia. And I attribute the latter to the fact that the regimes in those countries probably feel that they have very little elbow room themselves. And in other words, it's not the Soviets telling them don't reform. It's they being afraid to begin a liberalizing effort with the fear that they'll be swept out by sort of an aroused public, if it really gets aroused and they give them the opportunity. And this time, the Soviets probably won't come in and save them if the direct Soviet interests are not threatened. So, however, it does seem to me that there's a good possibility that over the next few years we will see some real liberalization, which will stop short of becoming sort of a threat to the Soviet Union, but will be done sort of within the Warsaw Pact so far as the security arrangements. So I'm not one who feels that an explosion there is inevitable by any means. In fact, it would surprise me.
Again, on Eastern Europe, isn't the Berlin Wall perhaps the sort of ultimate remaining symbol of the Cold War?
Absolutely.
And surely no one understands that better than Mr. Gorbachev himself.
Yes.
What do you see as his options to rid himself of the wall, and what can we do from the American side to encourage that?
Well, I think it's a little hard to make sure exactly how he assesses the pros and cons at a given time. But clearly, the wall has, on the one hand, a very dysfunctional effect upon his new slogan of a European home, one European home. What the heck kind of home is that if you've got a wall and barbed wire and guards shooting people if they want to go from room to room?
It has to go. He must understand.
And of course, the West Europeans are saying that.
Yeah.
So as long as that wall stands there, and as long as the East Germans and Czechs are actually killing people on the border who are trying to move across it, then obviously this is going to probably torpedo any real effective use of the European home concept, which obviously he considers of some value to him. By the way, when asked, sometimes they volunteer, they consider North America a part of that European home. They claim they're not trying to exclude us, though there is an implicit divisive effect there. But so on the one hand, it is inconsistent with what he's saying about his policies. On the other hand, of course, it is you might say, since it is in Germany, since it sits astride or cuts asunder the German nation, and since the continuation of that division is undoubtedly considered a primary Soviet interest, I think it's going to be rather difficult to get it down. What can we do about it? We can continue making it an issue. Because if we don't, and the Europeans don't, then they never will bring it down. Sort of like human rights in the past. There were some people who were saying, well, let's get on with arms control, let's get on with other things. You're just irritating them, making it an issue. And yet now we see them responding. And they're not responding entirely because we made it an issue, but they would hardly be responding if we hadn't made it an issue. And so I think that this is a legitimate issue, and I think that we should continue to point out the incongruity between their avowed policies in general and that abomination to mankind which it represents.
I have the suspicion, albeit unfounded, that the Europeans are not unhappy with the divided Germany. They will not necessarily back issues to bring the Germans together. But that's beside the point. I know during your career that you served in Prague as our ambassador during a difficult period. Well, almost all Czech periods the past 20 years have been difficult. And the thing that intrigues me is Czechoslovakia is the one country in East Europe that had an indigenous substantial left that participated in the what was at one time free elections. And you don't think that Gorbachev could use? Do you think that Gorbachev could use some initiatives to get the Czech regime to try and promote these tendencies into a more palatable form of government which is not so estranged from its population?
I think there's a real problem there. On the one hand, I'm not at all sure that Mr. Gorbachev really wants to micromanage that situation,
Okay.
or wants to get involve the Soviet Union directly in a way that could bring major destabilization. Number two, I think one has to say frankly that most of the creative forces which came out in great part from that indigenous left were simply trampled into the ground after '68, and by '72, under the slogan of normalization, most of the creative communists and those who were willing to move toward reform were simply cast out of the system. You know, you have situations like many of them working as janitors, if they were working at all, stokers in apartment houses, street sweepers, and I mean literally. So in effect, they put in people without the creativity, with only the loyalty, and that's one of the problems. These people have probably feel that they could not compete in a more open society. So in a certain sense, they're leaving it up to the Czechs, and yet you have a regime there which will find it very difficult, probably, to bring about these reforms in an orderly fashion, because they are such a minority, and because their own positions depend almost entirely upon retention of the previous sort of system. So I think that's rather difficult. I think there are certainly pressures for change, but how it's going to happen, I don't think this time it's going to happen on orders from Moscow.
Can I change the subject for a moment? Let's say during your career in the Foreign Service, you've served in countries outside of Europe, in third world countries, and given your thorough knowledge of the Soviet Union and your acquired expertise in these various other countries, how do you see the Soviet Union as perceived in these countries? Is it seen as a benevolent patron? Is it seen as a danger? Is it seen as a model, or what?
Well, you know, I haven't served in third world countries since really 1970, so it's been quite a while since I have physically been working in that environment. So I would hesitate to draw too broad conclusions at this moment. But I think in general, the word is out in most that the Soviet economic model at least doesn't work. That's something that's very hard to miss. Now, in the past, that message was probably somewhat overshadowed by another message, which was if you wanted to maintain political control over a country by a very small clique, the Leninist model worked very well. But it worked very well to the detriment of the overall health of the society. I would hope that that's better understood now, because many of the would-be dictators there who were following the Leninist model are either running into increasing difficulty or have been in fact thrown out. So I really do think that there is a lesson there that certainly some are probably capable of reading. After all, what are the success stories economically in the third world? They are not those who were following the Leninist model, but those who specifically rejected it. You know, the Taiwans, the South Koreas, the Singapores, the Ivory Coast, etc.
In fact, there are no success stories with Marxist-Leninist ideology. I mean,
absolutely
the only three countries who still give lip service to it are Albania, North Korea, and Cuba, and
look at what happens to their
shambles.
That's right, absolutely. And I think that's even the Soviets probably now realize that the current reforms are really an implicit and sometimes pretty explicit confession that it wasn't working.
That's what perestroika is all about.
That's what it's all about, absolutely. Moving toward a market system, moving off a command economy, moving away from all of the basic things, and having to examine even the basic philosophy behind it. Land has value, contrary to what Marx has said. Marx's theory of the labor theory of value just doesn't work. And this is very clear to the smarter people at the top, and their main problem is how do you get things adjusted, people's thinking adjusted without throwing too much out so that you totally lose confidence.
But how does one convince American politicians that Marxist-Leninist ideologies did in the war? I mean, it seems to be much more important to some of our politicians than it is to any of the members of the Communist Party in Moscow that ever we met.
Well, I don't know. I'm not sure I agree with that. Those I work with are quite happy to see confirmed what they have thought was the case and been confident was the case.
In the last, I was going to say it's 24 hours, but by now it's a little longer than that, maybe 48 or even 72 hours. Two pieces of news came from the Soviet Union, which may indicate, in some ways, the sort of breadth of the parameters that we have to deal with right now. On the one hand, you just made reference to the 20th Party Congress speech by Khrushchev. It was just published, of course, the day before yesterday for the first time officially in the Soviet Union. And the other event is the news of the intelligence community that the planes from the Soviet Union shipping the MiGs to Libya. Now, my question is, on the one hand, we have again, one more wall crashing with regard to Glasnost. And on the other hand, we have the kind of knee-jerk reaction. People like Bill Safire in the New York Times immediately gets very excited that, aha, we told you so. Now, does that news about the MiGs in particular, while the other news is very gratifying, does the diplomatic community have to kind of think about this hard and fast, that this is maybe a sign of something that's reversing the process that we need to be aware of, that there's more military posture here than we have allowed ourselves to think, and we can't get lulled into a relationship with the Soviet Union that may be deceptive?
Oh, I think there is a real danger in assuming that some of these new ideas, new concepts, prevail, without an exception in their policy, that they are already the order of the day. I think that is a real danger. However, I don't think that this sort of action totally invalidates things that have gone before. It is totally inconsistent if they're selling modern aircraft to Libya, totally inconsistent with their avowed policies of new thinking. There's no question about that. They've done other things that are inconsistent with it. And I would say this shows that all of these new ideas have not yet been implemented. Probably was unreasonable to expect that they would be, and it's another argument that we should be prudent and cautious in changing our policies until we see more evidence of change. On the other hand, I do think enough has changed in the way they deal with the outside world. They have withdrawn their forces from Afghanistan, though under conditions that could have been better. Granted, they have done other things which are more consistent with the new thinking than the old. So it's still a mixed picture, and I think the important thing is to continue for us to have a policy which continues to drive them in the direction which they themselves have set out. And I'm one who would argue strongly against assuming that that policy is complete, or that we're at the end of that line, and therefore that we can take unilateral steps, for example, to ease the pressure on them to reform. I don't think we should. But at the same time, I think it would not be very accurate to close our eyes to the changes that have occurred and to the potential for further change. Therefore, I don't think it totally invalidates the new thinking, but it certainly shows that they are capable of taking actions which are quite contrary to the avowed policy, and we have to be prepared to deal with the consequences of such violations of their new thinking, and encourage them to minimize them in the future, which you do not just with sweet reason, but also by having concrete counters in time.
Does this mean that we need to have, or perhaps we do, and you could articulate this, that we need to have our new thinking in place as well, rather than responding to events which we all too often seem to do?
Well, I would argue that it probably is more seeming than actuality. I think what we have seen in a massive stage, and I suspect that future historians will see this very clearly, is the Soviet response to our agenda. We defined the agenda in the areas where we're seeing Soviet responses, and though our definition of that and pushing on it was by no means the sole factor which pushed them, it was sufficiently in tune with the forces of history, to borrow a Marxian term, that I think it was, in my eyes, spectacularly successful. Now, after all, if we look at these specific agreements, these specific things which have happened, which have improved their relationship, these are all American policies. The zero INF with intrusive on-site inspection, that was not a Russian idea, that was our idea. And sure, we can say it's fine that they recognize it's also in their interest, but it's our idea. Look at the concern for human rights now, which the Soviets internally are debating more and more. Now, whose idea was that? And, you know, were they be concentrating on this to such a degree if we hadn't made such an issue of it? No way. They're out of Afghanistan militarily. All right, they could have done it in ways that were more constructive by not leaving so many arms there, by encouraging a replacement of the Najibullah regime with a broader based government, but they are out. And after all, for nearly 9 years, we were saying they shouldn't have gone in, they should get out. So whose idea was it that they should get out? Now, I'm not saying that just because we demanded it was the reason. Obviously, they got out because it wasn't working. But, you know, I can go over issue after issue. Who has been pushing exchanges against the Iron Curtain? Who has been telling them that you really should stop jamming, that you should put more outside ideas in your media? We have all along. You can think of our proposals over the years for open skies, for, you know, we set up radios and so on. Now they have stopped jamming. They are putting us in their media. They are responding to exchanges, even including younger people, like high school students. Up until a few years ago, we couldn't even get undergraduates on exchange programs. These are all American ideas, American initiatives. And I salute them for finally recognizing that these were not one-sided. They were in their interest, and I think you give them credit for that. But to say that these are Soviet initiatives somehow is simply violates all logic and all history.
That's interesting.
What about the Pacific Rim? What role do you see the Soviets carving out for themselves in the Pacific, maybe starting with Japan? How are they going to sort out the conflict over the islands, for example?
Well, on the one hand, of course, we have seen an expanding military presence in the Pacific, their use of Da Nang, and putting more and more naval forces into the area. That is not a very welcome development, of course, and it's not really welcomed by the countries in the area, China, Japan, Philippines, the others. So I think if they continue along that route, almost say a traditional geopolitical route of using military force, I suspect in the long run they may even find that counterproductive, but along the way there are going to be a lot of potential confrontations and problems and tensions raised by it. I would hope that they will moderate that particular aspect of their policy, but I have no assurance that they're going to. Now, as far as Japan is concerned in particular, I think they have been remarkably unresponsive to a major sort of Japanese concern over the Northern Territories. I think it is, on the one hand, it's perfectly clear that these islands have no absolute vital strategic significance for the Soviet Union, and particularly the southernmost, the Habamai Group and Shikotan. Now, I think they have more installations on the two northernmost of the Japanese Northern Territories. But even those, they could easily live without them. I think their real problem and their real hang-up here is to avoid a precedent. If they start giving up territory they've once taken, I think they feel that will open the floodgates to claims. After all, they are stewards of a state which has expanded historically, and all of whose borderlands once belonged to somebody else. And so they feel extremely vulnerable to irredentist claims. Not all these claims are active, but there are many potential ones out there. And I think this really worries them, and so even the southernmost of those islands, which I think Khrushchev at one point toyed with the idea of returning, if the Japanese would give them a quit claim on the other two, now even that doesn't seem to be active. Someday they may do it. But as of now, they have been quite rigid in rejecting this, and I think this has meant that they have not been able to develop the sort of relationship with Japan, which in theory they would like to have. Now with China, one gets a somewhat different picture, although there too, I think there are limits on how far they can go for strictly geopolitical reasons in moving towards an alliance. I don't think we're going to see another close Soviet-Chinese alliance. I think we will see a gradual normalization because it's in neither Chinese nor Soviet interest to be more at loggerheads with each other than each is with us. And of course, Gorbachev is going there next month, and that will be the culmination of a process of political normalization. The Soviets have acted, perhaps for other reasons, but they have acted to meet a large portion of the Chinese claims in regard to the three obstacles. They are out of Afghanistan now. They have announced reduction of the forces on the border, and there is some movement in settling the Cambodian question. So I think we'll see in regard to China a more normal relationship, and one which involves more trade, more travel back and forth, but probably still something of an arm's length relationship, which would preclude extensive international cooperation.
Given a best case scenario, that's to say, the development of perestroika, glasnost, and reform, where would you like to see our policies towards the Soviet Union go? This is a very iffy situation because I'm saying given a best case scenario.
Yeah, I think that given either a best or worst case scenario, given any scenario, fundamentally our policies should be designed, as they've been designed in the past, to combine sufficient strength, which means not only military strength, but also economic and strength of political will in defending our interests and making sure we can take care of such backsliding eventualities as, say, the sale of jets to Libya, with a forward-looking definition of the agenda, a willingness to negotiate in a hard-headed fashion, and when the Soviet leadership sees fit to come to terms to reach agreements which are in our interest and obviously in theirs as well. So I think that has been a successful policy. I think we need to continue that overall approach. Now, I think that we can begin now to add one element which was largely missing before in the relationship, and that is more overt and active cooperation in international efforts. In part because of the previous Soviet attitude toward international organizations, which tended to be anything but cooperative. That is changing, and there are a number of signs of that change in their attitude toward the United Nations and other international organizations, and in part because of the change in their own attitude toward the common interests of mankind, the need to work on environmental questions and others. I think that there is an opportunity there for more U.S.-Soviet cooperation in areas such as global environmental issues, in areas such as combating terrorism, in areas such as, to some degree, combating illicit narcotics trade, though they're not a big factor there. They can be helpful in some respects. And in areas such as trying to get some more effective rules on non-proliferation of not only of nuclear weapons, where we have been able to cooperate over the years on such non-proliferation questions, but a new one is raising its head now, and that is proliferation of ballistic missile technology. And that's one that also is not in our interest, that other countries start building, say, those classes of weapons that we are now abolishing. And also in chemical weapons, I think that there is a prospect of more cooperation in finding ways to reach a global ban. So there are a whole range of these issues, some quite important, which cannot be solved in a bilateral context. And I think we can look forward to more and more U.S.-Soviet cooperation in the world, on a world scale in many of these. So I think all of these put together will be consistent with the sort of approaches we've had in the past, but there may be a number of elements of new content there.
One of the things that all the Soviets that I have been talking to lately tell me, and it's pretty unanimous, is that basically not that we can't go home again, but we can't go back again. The general accepted view seems to be that Gorbachev has really kind of gone beyond a certain point at which it would be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to return to. The image of a re-Stalinization seems to be something that they, if I'm reading them correctly, rather remote. Now, again, I go back on the long view, and I see the 1920s a lot here. I think that there's at least a lack of connection there that might be made a little bit more. I understand the differences maybe outweigh the similarities in the long run, but it was a time when the society was as open as it ever had been. The cultural life, the political life, the economic developments, transformations of an enormous sort, which simply can't even be put into a few words, were the order of the day. Again, like it is today, every day one would wake up, read the newspapers, and extraordinary things would be available in terms of choices, possibilities. And yet, we know where all that led to. It led to a very paranoid view of the outside world, and it led to desperate debates within, which ultimately created a Stalin to a large extent. I guess my question to you is, in viewing things as you see them so closely in Moscow, is the feeling that that can't happen again something that you would agree with? That re-Stalinization really couldn't be the result of the opening as it was once before in the 20s?
I think there could be attempts to do so. I don't think it would work this time, and I think there are essential differences with the 20s. I'm not sure, maybe I'm misquoting, but wasn't it Marx who said when history repeats itself, the first time it's a tragedy and the second time
Hegel,
a farce?
yeah.
Was over, is it Hegel? Okay. In any event, I think it would be the farcical, in a Hegelian sense, repetition if they tried. In other words, after all, in the 20s, they did not come out of a heritage of Stalinism. This time, I think they have been sensitized, the society as a whole, increasingly sensitized, both to the dangers and to the techniques that made that possible. Now, obviously, there are no absolute institutional barriers to attempts, if a given party leadership wished to try, to return to that. But I think it would be so disastrous that it would have to be abandoned fairly rapidly. And I really question whether any possible leadership is going to see it in their interest to try. So I guess my answer would be, in the long run, I really think there is probably no realistic alternative to the course they're taking now, which is trying to bring their society more in line with the modern world. And I think what lies under that, and what gives me a certain confidence, I think that, and here perhaps I'm showing prejudice, it's certainly showing a long time assessment, is that the basic Marxist ideology on which so much of Stalinism was based is simply incorrect.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can build a structure on a lie, and it works only so long. And it works only, and a lot of this is understood now in a sense that it wasn't understood before. So we shall see. But I really think that in the long run there probably is no going back in the real sense.
Mm.
After 4 years of Gorbachev, why do you think it is that with many American Sovietologists and in our press, there's still so much negativism? It's as though each new reform of Gorbachev will surely be his last. Professor Goldman at Harvard, until a few months ago, would go on TV periodically predicting the exact year that Gorbachev would meet his demise.
Well, I know some who have been giving him 3 years ever since he came in. He's been in 4 years now, and that expected economic dividend hasn't come yet. I don't think that's pleasant for him. On the other hand, I do think that sometimes those who make these predictions, on the one hand, I think they may be excessively economic deterministic. I certainly don't deny that economics are very important, or that it affects the public mood, that the food situation is not getting better, and that there are not more consumer goods. That is absolutely obvious. There's a lot of complaining. A lot of people are feeling that perestroika hasn't given them much. Mm-hmm. But man does not live by bread alone. People are not starving, which can push people to desperation. It is not a parliamentary system where there's going to be a sudden vote of no confidence on some issue and he's going to be voted out. And as a matter of fact, this leadership has given the Soviet people a lot of things that they appreciate, have wanted, and given credit for. They're out of Afghanistan. That was extremely popular. Relations have eased with the United States, and people are no longer afraid of nuclear war suddenly breaking out, and that is extremely popular. They are now being given some chance to vote, and though, as we've discussed, we don't know exactly how that's going to turn out, that has been extremely popular. And one could say, well, maybe there hasn't been much extra bread, but there's been a certain amount of circuses. So, I mean, things have happened that are genuinely popular. And to say that, well, everything depends upon getting more stuff in the shops, well, maybe they'll turn out to be right in the long run. Certainly, at some point, the populace is going to get even more cynical and more sullen if they don't see some economic dividends.
They've been promised more stuff in the shop for 70 years.
That's right. I mean, I think you do have a population which, quite frankly, their expectations haven't been all that high. one can talk about the danger of raising expectations too high. If anything, the problem has been the population has been cynical and saying, well, just one more campaign, it isn't going to make any difference this time anyway. Well, they didn't rebel before, and I don't, see much signs they're going to rebel now. Except that, there are new, to be fair, there are new forces at work there, particularly forces of nationalism. And of course, these, if they get out of hand, could present the current leadership with some very stark choices. I think it is understood that if you move too far, too rapidly in repressing these various things, you may make the whole reform effort impossible. And I think that explains why in many issues, when they have been posed now, we've seen negotiation rather than repression. The big question is, can they continue along this course and avoid the sort of, you might say, explosion which would require a repression, which in turn would condemn the whole process of reform. I think we have to recognize that's a possibility. But I also think it's a distinct possibility that, imperfect as the system is, we will see the reform effort pushing along, sputtering at times, even maybe moving off a direct course at times to meet political needs, and yet somehow continuing as an effort. I think that at least is equally plausible.
The American denial of perestroika reminds me of growing up in Jackson, Mississippi in the 1950s. And 100 years after the war, and you know which war I mean, white Mississippians were still denying that we lost the war. But in the case of the Soviet Union, it seems to me abundantly clear that the ideological war is over and that we won, and that they know that we won, and why must we continue to sort of rub salt in the wounds? And in particular, since many of the things you've been saying today suggest that on almost everything we've ever said we'd like the Soviets to do, they're doing it, whether it be get Afghanistan, human rights, etc. So why do we need to continue spending $300 billion a year protecting ourselves from the Russians when they're basically emulating our behavior? I don't understand.
Well, I think partly is they're not completely emulating our behaviors yet, and they have a military machine which in many respects still is superior, and in the case of conventional weapons in Europe, even after the reductions they have announced, which is certainly a positive step from our standpoint, will be superior. So it seems to me it's premature to raise the question, for reasons we were talking before, of unilateral cuts on our behalf. I think we should be negotiating, as we are, on the sort of mutual cuts that will bring us down to equal levels. I think we should be pressing and negotiating on changes in force structure, particularly on their part, to a more defensive posture. NATO does not have an offensive posture, but in the Warsaw Pact, entirely aside from their predominance in armor and artillery, which is a great predominance and which will still be there after the cuts that they have announced as taking place over the next 2 years, entirely aside from that, they have at the front lines units which are specialized at seizing and holding territory, which is not true of NATO. In other words, assault troops, bridging equipment, and all of the sort of things that are not relevant to a purely defensive campaign. Now, if they want to, place in practice the new thinking, which in theory says that one country cannot secure its security at the expense of others, they've got to change all that. But I think until they do, we have the right to say, well, now wait, why we already have a defensive posture. We have already shown restraint in that respect. We have not only a doctrine of defense in Europe, we have depositions which clearly embody that. Until you do so, why should we be changing ours? And so I do think that we've got to show the steadiness of nerve to keep our strength up during this process, because even though we can hope that the process will continue, we can hope that they will eventually find ways to put their current defensive words into action. They haven't done it yet, and it would be quite irresponsible for us, I think, to change prematurely. Furthermore, if we did so, we would actually remove many of the incentives, if one wants to use a good word, for them to move in the direction that they have announced and that they want to move. Let me give you a good example of that, because I think it's very indicative. Many people fought against the deployment of the Pershings and cruise missiles in Western Europe in 1983 when the question came up, saying that, well, this would condemn arms control. The Soviets would react so negatively to it. The contrary turned out to be the case. And when we signed the INF agreement to eliminate these classes of weapons, I watched the debate in the Soviet Union. And it was not lost on the Soviet public that they were giving up 5, 6, or more warheads to every one that the West was giving up. And they asked why. Why should we give up more than they do? And what was the answer? The answer is the Americans have Pershing missiles in Europe that can hit us in 8 minutes. We're getting rid of those missiles. And our SS-20s can't hit them. Now, suppose we hadn't had those Pershings. How would they have justified in their own minds or to their own public going to zero? So, you know, this is, I think, is a prime example that simply caving in or making concessions early doesn't necessarily bring you where you want to go or where both countries should be. And I think we have many comparable situations today, mutatis mutandis, and we simply need to keep a clear view. What are we after? What is the concrete situation? And certainly we shouldn't ignore the new rhetoric, the new thinking, but we should find ways to make sure they have the maximum incentive to move in that direction concretely and the maximum disincentive to break out of it, such as we're seeing in the sale of planes to Libya. I think that should serve as a good reminder that they're not there yet overall in their avowed policies.
Ambassador Matlock, on behalf of the university and my colleagues, let me thank you for a most interesting and stimulating morning. Thank you.